Hello, welcome to the first Fall 2025 Northeast Cover Crops Council webinar. I'm Victoria Ackroyd, Northeast Cover Crop Council Program Manager. My co-host is Susan Brulette, Program Manager for the Northwest Crops and Soils Program at UVM Extension. Before I introduce today's speaker, there's a little bit of housekeeping. So first off, if you have questions, which is awesome, feel free to throw them into the chat as they come to mind, and I'll handle question and answer moderation at the end of the webinar. Today's session counts for one crop management CCA CEU. So please either put your full name and CCA CEU number in the chat. To keep it private, you can just address Susan directly, or you can email your full name and CCA number to Susan after the session, and we'll throw her email in the chat as well, probably after folks are done coming through the waiting room. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available soon on the UVM and NECCC websites, along with a PDF of the presentation. And now for today's speaker, Dr. Heather Darby. Heather is an agronomic and soil specialist for the University of Vermont Extension and chair of the Northeast Cover Crops Council. She was raised on a dairy farm in Northwest Vermont, which allowed her to play an active role in all aspects of dairy farming and gain knowledge of the land. These practical experiences, complemented by her education, have focused her attention towards sustainable agriculture and the promotion of environmental stewardship. Her research interests and outreach programs are in the areas of fuel, forage, and grain production systems in New England. Today, Heather will be speaking about cover crops for forage. Heather, thank you for speaking. You have the floor.
Great, thanks, Victoria. Right, I'm gonna share my screen here. How does that look? Can you see this, Victoria?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Great, all right. Well, thanks everyone for attending today. At least where I am here in Vermont, it's a beautiful, sunny, but cool afternoon, and really definitely starting to feel like fall. And I know at least here in Vermont, farmers are out harvesting corn silage as we speak and working to get those cover crops planted as soon as possible, because at least here in Vermont, we're actually getting towards being just a little too late to plant cover here. But what I want to talk about today is using cover crops as a forage um, and double cropping. So, talking about this topic mostly, I would say, from the perspective of planting the cover crop, following corn silage in particular here, and then using that as a forage crop the next spring before planting the subsequent cash crop. So I want to talk about some, really specific practices, species selection, some other considerations people should be thinking about, a little bit about storage and feeding the crop. And if we have time, we'll dive more into some other alternatives outside of kind of cereal grains, which is what's probably the most common, at least here, for double cropping or using cover crop as a forage. All right, so um, why would we even consider using cover crops as a forage? And I realize there is some disagreement around around this about whether or not cover crops should be anything else besides a cover crop. But I will say I'm definitely a proponent for thoughtful consideration around utilizing these cover crops as a forage after they have served their purpose as a cover crop through, at least here, throughout the winter months. Um, so cover crops can make a great feed source for livestock. They can be very high yielding, but probably for many, more importantly, a very high quality, nutritious crop. and they can kind of fill in some feed gaps, depending on the scenario we're talking about. Um, and they can be used in a multitude of ways. They can be grazed, they can be stored feed, and in some cases, although we won't be talking about that today, they could also be harvested for seed. Now, there is a great publication that came out in 2024 in May, and it was put out by the USDA Economic Research Service. And I don't know if anybody has seen this publication, but it's called Cover Crops on Livestock Operations, the Potential for Expansion in the United States. And again, I have the the reference in here, but oh, I guess you can't really see that. But I was showing you the cover page. It is an absolutely fascinating summary of livestock operations and what data we have basically from the census on how livestock operations are using cover crops as forage. And the summary of this entire document was, you know, using cover crops as forage could have the potential to really expand the adoption of cover cropping across the United States. So, one of the reasons for that, of course, is what I just talked about, is that farms can utilize these covers in multiple ways and they can gain more benefit from this work on their farm beyond the most important benefit, of course, of protecting the soil from erosion and nutrient loss, etc. But there is a lot of mounting data, through the ag census to show this could be a great way to see much larger expansion of cover crops across this country. So this is out of that publication, just showing different opportunities for cover crop management for forages on livestock operations in the United States. Again, we'll be predominantly talking about the bottom one, which is utilizing, or sorry, the middle one, which is utilizing cover crops for spring forage. But again, there are lots of opportunities here, and I've seen most of these actually utilized here in Vermont and throughout the Northeast. So again, a lot of opportunity for using covers to do all the great things that cover crops do, but also provide an added benefit to the farm by serving as some really high quality livestock feed. This is out of that same publication that you can see the citation on the bottom, where they were looking at the proportion of farms that were reporting using cover crops as forage, whether it was grazed or harvested, and then what percentage of those farms were not harvesting cover crops. And this is, quite old data really at this point, but you can see on cow, calf, and dairy operations that between 89 and 72% of the operations were doing something in regard to livestock feed with their cover crops. So most of the cover crops on those livestock operations are being utilized for feed. So again, that changes really a lot about how we manage the cover crop and how we look at them as well. Okay, so again, cover crops are a really high quality feed, and the top of this got cut off, but this is showing digestible fiber of different crops. And you can see that there are corn silage, BMR corn silage. There's standard, I guess, perennial grass haylage and legume haylage. Okay, those are the normal livestock feedstuffs throughout most of the Northeast. Okay, and then on the bottom line here, you can see 25%, 35%, 45%. This is the level of digestible fiber. So, of course, we want um, highly digestible fiber to gain weight, put on meat, and to make milk in our livestock. And you can see that most of the samples, this blue line here for small grain silage, have a digestible fiber of over 55%. Now, that's really good. We actually are looking for forage that is above 65% regularly. And the only crop that meets that is BMR corn silage. But overall, small grain silage is very, very digestible if it's harvested timely. And again, that can reduce expensive inputs on farms. And when I say that, I mean grain. When you're producing forage that has digestibility, fiber digestibility over 65%, um, you certainly can reduce the amount of concentrate you're feeding in a balanced diet. Okay, so there's a lot to think about here. And, in my own opinion and what I've seen is that if farmers want to plant cover crops and utilize them for forage, they generally are working harder and planning better to take care of that cover crop so that they can maximize um, the amount of biomass and quality that they get out of that cover crop. So I don't know how to say this nicely, but honestly, they're doing a better job. Okay. They're planting the crop more timely. They're making sure that it has, enough fertility to grow. They're thinking about all the pieces in their cropping system to make sure that they're going to get a really high quality and high yielding forage crop out of that investment. And so ultimately, I do think that if farmers are utilizing their cover crop as a forage, they're going to be getting more biomass production, which again helps build soil health, reduce erosion, etc. But there's a lot of planning that has to go into that. And it's not just throwing the cover crop out whenever you have time in the fall. Okay, so we've got a lot of planning that has to go in, should go in whether you're doing it for forage or not, but a lot of planning and forethought before you can, be ready to grow a cover crop for forage. Right. So if you want to, again, have a high biomass cover crop to harvest for forage, it needs to be planted timely, which means you need to get the corn harvested before November, and actually even before October. You need to have ground that is ready to plant into, and also has enough fertility left in the field to be able to produce a high biomass crop. Okay, so that means thinking about all of these things well before now. One of the big items here, of course, like I said, people are still out harvesting corn. We're having, we had a late spring like many people. Corn got planted late, and even reducing the maturity of that corn, people are still harvesting, will be harvesting well into October. But our goal here is to get the corn harvested, really in September. We want to get those cover crops planted by the third week of September, actually, or the very last week of September. And so, in order to do that, we need to be matching that desire with the maturity of the corn that we're selecting. Now, again, this is Vermont specific, but here, if we want to be having the corn harvested really by mid September to the third week of September, we need to be planting corn really in that 90 to 96 day range. And again, it depends where you live in Vermont. Um, and it may be a little shorter and it could be a little longer, but we definitely don't want to be planting 100-day relative maturity corn silage because we know that that will be pushing our harvest, into October in most years. Okay, so again, I don't have the answers specific for for your area, but our target planting time, at least here in the upper part of the Northeast, really is the third week of September. Very similar to planting for grain harvest for wheat or barley or any of those crops, to optimize growth in the fall and biomass in the spring. So adjusting corn maturities to achieve that is critical. So again, as far as planting date goes, again, here in Vermont, once we get into October, the amount of biomass goes way down. And again, you know, this this changes year to year, and we don't have a lot of consistent weather. But I will say, even from my most recent studies in the last couple of years, getting that cover crop seeded by that third week of September really is ideal in terms of establishment, tiller production, and spring biomass the next year. And that still holds true, regardless of how much, the climate has changed. All right, as far as seeding rate goes, again, for forage, you want to have more biomass. Sometimes with cover crops, you want to manage the biomass a little bit because it might be difficult to deal with the subsequent crop. Um, and in many cases, people are actually trying to reduce the seeding rates because of that reason. This is some data that was actually collected with a bigger group of the Northeast Cover Crop Council, looking at planting dates and seeding rates of winter rye. There's a lot here to unpack, but really what we've observed here in Vermont, again, up in the upper part of the Northeast, is seeding at about 80 to 100 pounds of winter rye per acre at that third week of September, provides us with the best ground cover going into the fall and also the most biomass in the subsequent spring. Now, I know this will differ if you're in a more southern location, that people in those locations are likely around 50, maybe 75 pounds. But here again, we're looking at about 80 pounds around the third week of September, and then increasing after that, up to 100 and maybe even higher. All right, the predominant cover crop here and in most places across the United States is cereal rye or winter rye, and there's good reason for that. Mostly because it can grow. Seems like it can grow on cement if you threw it out there. It's a tough, really hardy crop. It can grow in marginal soils. It can grow in really great soils, but mostly it can grow at the lowest temperatures. That is really important to us in the Northeast, obviously. And so rye can germinate at temperatures ranging anywhere from 33 to 41 degrees. And this is why cereal rye is so popular, is that you have a longer window to get that crop in the ground and still see some growth. All right. But our goal with planting for forages, and, again, should also be for cover crops, is to make sure that you get ample growth in the fall. And really, when I say ample growth, what we're really shooting for is tiller development. And tillers are side shoots of plants that grow off from the main stem, right? So if you look at the slide or the little image below, you can see here one single plant, the 2-leaf stage. Okay, so you put a seed in the ground and it germinates, and this is likely what you see, right? You see kind of one plant coming out of the ground, and then that plant continues to grow if it has enough time in the fall, right? And if there's enough time, it will start to set tillers. And you can see in the second image here, T1 down at the bottom. So T1 is kind of the growth of a side shoot or a tiller. And then as you're going through the tillering stage, you're going to get more tillers. Okay. Generally, I think about the maximum number of tillers for rye is about 5. Okay. So from one seed, you could potentially get 5 plants growing out of it. And that's really what you want to be shooting for, right? Because then you can reduce the seeding rate, right? One seed equals 5 plants. And you can also get better cover going into the fall, more strength for that plant. So you can reduce the seeding rate and get more cover. Now, you really need 4 to 6 weeks of growth in the fall to get that strong tillering going. So again, this is why in Vermont we're saying 3rd week of September. In most years, you should have enough time, given that rye can grow at low temperatures, to get tiller development to its maximum number. And again, this will vary depending on the weather, right? Okay. So again, for rye, and people have asked me this before, so I'll just put it out there. Can I plant rye in the spring? And the answer really is no, because rye does need a vernalization period for it to be able to sort of set heads the next year. Okay. So at the end of the day, half of the yield, whether you're harvesting for grain or forage, or if you're growing for cover crop, will come from the tillers themselves. So making sure you're planting timely will help increase growth, biomass, root biomass, all of those things. Now, this is why as your planting gets later into the season, right? You're getting at least here into October. Maybe if you're down in Maryland, that might be into November. But here, as you're getting into October, you actually need to increase your seeding rate, because what you're going to get is just one plant per seed instead of 5. So you've got to increase the seeding rate to be able to get more soil cover and more biomass at the end of the day. So again, this is economics, as well as, improving the benefits you get from the cover crop. And if you're harvesting for forage, the amount of forage you're going to get on the other end. Okay. So again, variety selection of the corn that you're growing, or soybeans, or maybe grain corn, is really important so that you get that timely planting. And here, this is data from Vermont again. But if you're planting kind of the normal planting time in Vermont between mid-May and 3rd week of May, you can see, depending on the maturity of the corn, when you would be harvesting. And so cutting back on the maturity is really important here to get that good establishment and productivity. So just to give you a better picture of what these tillers look like, you can see in the top row, these are all rye plants that have tillered. They look great. You can see how much more biomass is there, how much more root system. And then down below, these plants have not tillered. Okay, so this is a really, really important concept for people to understand. And it really is primarily influenced, again, by planting date, and how much time and growing degree days we have between emergence and dormancy. All right, so this again is data out of Vermont. This was collected 2 years ago. in a study that I conducted looking at planting date and number of tillers. So you can see the fourth week or third week of September that I keep harping on here. We had between four, right around 4 tillers, I guess, between 4 and 4.5 tillers per plant. And then as we planted later, so basically every week until close to the end of October, you can see the number of tillers declines drastically. Basically, even a week later for us, into October, we saw half as many tillers. And then really after that for us, you're not getting any tillers again. So this is when you would want to increase the seeding rate to improve the stand. Okay, so I've beat that one to death. Timing of planting, critical. Um, so you want to get that tillering in the fall to get more biomass the next spring, reduce seeding rates, etc. Okay, so what about nutrient management? I wasn't really sure where to put this, but this is something I've seen farmers get caught on a little bit, especially for the subsequent crop. Um, if you're growing cover crops, they're plants, they need nutrients to grow and be robust and do what we want them to do. Now, I've had people tell me before, I don't know anybody that fertilizes their cover crops. Well, at least on most livestock operations, people are applying manure, generally in the fall, sometimes in the spring. But for many of our farms, they are applying fall manure before they plant the cover crop, um, or trying to anyway. And so you can see how the harvest date of the corn is really important, especially if you need to put manure down before you plant the cover crop. Um, but in that case, in most cases, the cover crop itself is relying on um, what's left over, right? What's left over after growing the quote unquote cash crop. And so sometimes people are disappointed with how the cover crop has performed. And again, that sometimes has to do with the fact that, well, there just weren't enough nutrients there for the crop to really kind of take off and grow. And that can be the case. Um, for the most part on dairy operations, if there has been manure added, that is plenty, plenty of fertility to grow a cover crop, more than what's needed often. So people don't think about adding fertility for cover crops um, at all. But if you're growing a cover crop as a forage, and again, you're trying to maximize the biomass that you're harvesting, it has become more and more common for farmers to add some type of nitrogen source, primarily in the spring. Um, and this would be about the same time that the farmers would be out fertilizing their hay crops, so their grass fields, in the spring. So oftentimes, if you're not familiar with this system, farmers will put on a very early season application of nitrogen to their grass ground to be able to maximize first cut growth and yields. And this has also become common on cover crops that are being used for forage. And generally, it is synthetic fertilizer being put on in April. Um, and again, this is to maximize biomass. There has been very, very little research done on this. There has been in the Northeast anyway. I only know of 1 or 2 studies that have been done out of Corinne Kettering's lab at Cornell, where they did show an economic return on about 50 pounds of nitrogen that was applied to that cover crop forage crop at dormancy break. So again, this is common to get more out of that cover crop for forage, but more work needs to be done here. Now, how does all of this impact the subsequent crop? And this is where I've seen people run into issues, because when you're harvesting the cover crop and removing it from the field, you're taking away high quality forage, and it's high quality because it's packed full of nutrients. And you have to make sure you account for the nutrients that you have now removed from that field. And again, if you're working with a crop consultant and you have a nutrient management plan, this should be built into the recommendations. You can use a forage test to determine nutrient removal for the cover crop. Again, you can use book values, but many farmers have run into some surprises, I'll say, when they've removed a high biomass forage crop in the spring and didn't account for that nutrient removal in their fertility plans for the corn. So in the table here, you can just see book value um, for nutrient removal of, this is a rye forage harvest, and it's pounds per ton of dry matter. So again, you're removing about 50 pounds of nitrogen, 18 pounds of phosphorus, and 80 pounds of potassium. Most farms will only get about a ton of dry matter, but still that's quite a lot of nutrients, again, that you need to make sure that you're accounting for when you're thinking about how you're going to fertilize your next corn crop or whatever you might be growing there. All right, let's move into harvesting. And this will bring us into conversations around species and variety selection. Okay, so generally, if this is being harvested for stored feed, we're looking to harvest in the boot stage. And the boot stage is basically when you can see the head bulging and almost ready to emerge from the plant. There's a really, really close up picture here that doesn't do it justice. But the important note here is harvesting at the boot stage for stored feed is kind of that best compromise between yield and quality. Okay, so harvesting before that is fine, but you're going to get, less yield. Harvesting past the boot stage, you'll get more yield, but the quality will be far less. Okay, now the trick here, of course, is that it can go from flag leaf to boot stage very, very quickly, and it can move out of boot stage very quickly as well. So, we're only looking at a few days on either side of that growth stage. And that, as a farmer, right, it can be very, very hard to manage. So as soon as there is a decent window, and we're talking early spring here, right, when these things are heading out, as soon as there's a decent window, people are generally out mowing, kind of regardless of the stage. So they're more worried about getting the quality versus the quantity. However, if you have a beef operation and you're not as worried about the high quality feed, you may choose to wait. But again, at that time of the year, everything is up in the air, right? So when you want to get your cash crop harvested, you have a defined window for that. And again, if you get a window to harvest this forage, most people usually take it irregardless, because they also don't want to start pushing into their optimum time for cash crop harvest. Okay, so this is where we start thinking about variety and species selection. And Varieties differ greatly, and so don't species in when they actually mature, right? So just like I was talking about with corn, you need to be thinking about these same characteristics with your cover crop, your cereal grain, because you're going to want to match the maturity with kind of the timing of harvest that you want to see. So just winter rye alone can mature 7 to 10 days earlier than wheat and triticale. And within winter rye, the varieties themselves, or any of these species, the varieties themselves can differ in heading timing by as much as 10 days, right? So if you want to be planting your corn, let's say by mid-May, you're going to want a rye variety, or a small grain variety that heads out earlier. If you want flexibility and you want to make sure that you're getting the best quality, you may want something that heads out later. And we have seen a number of the farms here anyway switch over to growing winter wheat, because it does head out later. But again, variety selection matters here. And you can manage some of that maturity by selecting the right variety. So this again is from some of our studies here in Vermont, looking at boot stage harvest date. And again, this will be year dependent, of course, but again, you can see what varieties head really early and then what rye varieties head much later. And you can see there's quite a difference here. And so understanding that one characteristic of the variety you're selecting is critical. And this is why we definitely promote putting a known variety in the ground so that you know when it's going to head out, you know the tillering potential, you know the yield potential, and you are setting yourself up for success. All right. So just to go back to yield and quality, that's really going to differ depending on when you harvest. And again, what stage you choose to harvest the cover crop in, may be dictated by the weather, of course, but may also be dictated by the type of livestock that you have, or the group of livestock you're going to feed with this forage. But you can see when you're in the boot stage, we generally see about a ton of dry matter per, this is in hectare, but it's almost equivalent, per acre here. This would be roughly about a ton in the boot stage. And as that crop becomes more mature, the amount of yield goes up, but you can see clearly the quality goes down. So we go from around a 20% crude protein feed down to about 10%. And we're looking at the digestibility of that feed. We go from something that is exceptional, around 65% digestible fiber, down below 50. So again, really depending on what you're feeding on your farm, how you want to manage this feed stuff will really determine, what stage you harvest in. But generally, the boot stage is the most common stage. All right. So again, as far as variety selection goes, it does matter. And here's a number of different winter rye varieties that we have trialed up in Vermont. You can see the yields here are exceptional, well above what I was just showing you, and I would say well above normal. We had a great fall, a lot of tillers here, but you can see there's a big difference in varieties in regard to yield. So variety does matter to optimize yield and digestibility. So you can see some of these varieties are approaching 80 to 85% fiber digestibility, and then others are much lower. So interesting here, a rustic rye, which most people probably know was bred as a cover crop to be used as a cover crop. And then you have a variety like Hazelet, which performed much differently. You can see has different characteristics, yield wise and digestibility wise. So, again, variety matters here. And many people are doing trials now to evaluate different varieties. And this is all on our website. The variety that you might select for a forage harvest might be really different than what's going to do best as a cover crop, if that's your only sole purpose. And ideally, what we want to do is select a variety that is going to optimize both, right? We want to select a variety that's going to serve as a great forage crop, but also as a great cover crop. And you can see from this data, we were looking at ground cover in particular in the fall. And you can see Gardner, Hazelet, Aristic, Progas, and Receptor all performed similarly in regard to ground cover. And if you remember from the past slide, this variety Hazelet also was an exceptional forage crop. So again, it's kind of matching up all the characteristics we want and trying to get all the benefit that we can. So again, really looking at varieties with that in mind makes a lot of sense. Okay. So let's look at different types of cover crops for forage. And these are being grazed. This study, they were grazed, but you can see they were grazed at different stages. And the yield was actually measured by clipping. So, but just that different growth stages. So again, if you look at the bottom or the top, you can see there are some differences between the species. If you're harvesting it at the boot stage, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of difference in yield. If you're harvesting it for grazing, which would be a little bit earlier, you can see there was a pretty significant difference in yield there, depending on the species. And same for quality. So species selection, again, that's really geared towards what's going to grow best on your farm, and what fits into your end goals. They'll all do the trick kind of one way or the other, but paying close attention to what it is you need and want from that cover crop as a forage will determine what variety you might select and what species you might select as well. But they can all be high yielding and high quality regardless. Okay, I just don't want to kind of pushing up on time. So let's talk a little bit about harvesting for stored feed, because there's a couple of things I wanted to mention here, especially for practitioners or farmers that are on. So when we're harvesting a cover crop for forage, it tends to be pretty early in the season. And the other piece here is that you're not out harvesting a perennial forage stand that's well established and that has good kind of cover on the ground, right? So, we are highly concerned here about ash content of the feed. And if you're not familiar with that, basically, we don't want you getting dirt or soil. In this case, we'd consider it dirt in the feed. Okay, so once you contaminate that feed with soil from the ground, it really reduces the quality. It can impact not just the quality, but the fermentation can cause big, significant risks to animal health. So we want to make sure you're thinking about um, that risk. And so you want to make sure that you're mowing off the ground. You want to keep that mower quite high, maybe even higher than 4 inches, but I would say keep it at about 4 inches and then avoid raking, right? Because that ground is pretty exposed. Even with a good stand of rye, you're still going to see a lot of bare soil there. It may have been worked up the following spring, etc. So you just want to put practices into place to reduce contamination with soil. The other thing is just making sure it gets dry enough before you put it into storage. And this can be difficult during this time of the year because it tends to be cooler. It's not always as sunny, the sun not as hot, the ground might be wet. So there's a lot of things working against you here, but really trying to get that forage dry enough to put into storage is critical. This tends to be really wet feed. So again, just paying attention to these things can be very helpful. Using an inoculant when you're harvesting, critical here again, because the feed can tend to be wet. Um, and then making sure that it gets packed properly in the bunk or however you're storing that feed is really important. A lot of these crops have hollow stems, so a lot of air in them. So reducing the chop length can really help with getting the proper density in the bunk. But again, you can have really high quality feed there, but it can turn into a mess because of some of these issues with harvesting and storage. Let's talk a little bit about pasturing. Um, Cover crops are great for pasture. And if you have a crop farm and you have a neighbor that needs early spring pasture, or you're a grazing herd, whether you're dairy or beef, and you need really early pasture, cover crops are just a key ticket here. I've done a lot of work on this on farm, and what we generally see is cows being turned out, at least here in Vermont, 7 to 14 days earlier than the animals would be turned out into perennial cool season pasture. So there can be a ton of benefits here to the farm. Um, Basically, one thing is you get the cows outside earlier, which is great for the cows. They're grazing a super high quality feed. This is going to be higher quality feed than even a perennial pasture at this time. There's a good amount of biomass there. And actually, we've been able to graze the cover crop twice before we even put cows out to normal pasture. So this can be a real benefit to grazing farms as a way to, again, get the cows out on pasture earlier and get them off stored feed. We have a lot of farms, very, very limited in stored feed because of, erratic climate issues. So this provides a wonderful opportunity for them if they can work it into their cropping system. Okay, so I only have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure to leave time for questions. So I won't go into more around grazing systems with cover crops, but I will show this picture. These are cows grazing triticale in the early spring in Vermont. And you can see it's quite a lush and full stand, and they're pretty happy to be out there. And I think Victoria. Oh, one last thing. I will end on this because there were a couple other items I wanted to mention before we go into questions. But two things. Now, number one, herbicide selection There's a lot of considerations that need to be made here. And I can't tell you what herbicides to use in your cash crop. That's something you need to work with your consultant on. And also, it differs in state, but you really have to make sure you're following the label. This has become an issue here. Planting restrictions. So when can you plant rye? um, After whatever herbicide you're using, what's the rotational restrictions. And the other big one is harvest restrictions. And this is one a lot of people aren't thinking about. If you are going to harvest that cover crop, you might be grazing it in the fall, or you might be grazing it in the spring, or you might be harvesting it as storage feed in the spring. Are you following the label for the herbicides that were used in the cash crop the subsequent year? So again, something to think about. Make sure you're following the label. And then lastly, our environmental considerations. And this has come up a lot. What are the trade-offs from the environmental perspective, growing a cover crop versus forage? They are different, and you have some different goals here. What I'd like to encourage us all to do is sort of bring those goals together and try to optimize each the best we can, when we think about possibly managing those cover crops for forage. Okay, so that's what I'll end on, Victoria, and we'll take any questions.
Awesome job, Heather. Thank you. We do have a few questions in the chat. So just taking it from the top, somebody said, glad you mentioned fertility left in the field. This year was especially dry, and the person noticed some of the encapsulated fertilizer was still sitting on the ground. They're wondering how that might affect next year's crop.
Yeah, well, exactly. I don't know if it's been dry everywhere, but it has up here in the northern part of our region. And from my experience, in dry years, followed by dry years, or even a normal year, that fertility will be there for the subsequent crop. And if we start to get some rainfall, hopefully the cover crop, if it can establish under the dry conditions, we'll be able to utilize some of that. But yes, I think most importantly, at least up in Vermont and other parts of the Northeast, we use pre-side dress nitrate test prior to top dressing corn. And that is really, really important practice for us to continue to use, given, the way the climate has been acting.
Thank you. Another question, is manure typically applied following silage harvest and before planting?
So it depends on the farm and timing. A lot of farms, not all, but a number of farms like to spread manure in the fall. They may have to. Um, in Vermont, we have a winter spreading ban, and so people cannot spread in the winter. They can't spread until the following spring. So again, depending on the year when the corn is harvested, they may get manure on those fields and incorporated and the cover crop planted. I have seen people spread manure onto an already established cover crop, if the conditions are right. So it really depends, on the year, and the situation. But I've seen it done always.
So related to that, I'm going to skip to Paul's asking, do they spread manure before or immediately following seeding prior to seedling emergence? And if so, after how long or how large do the seedlings need to be? So
Yeah.
related to what you just
Yeah,
said.
I think it's the same. I mean, ideally, people don't want to go back on the
Mm.
seeded cover crop if they don't have to. Um, but I have seen, people go back on those fields when the cover crop um, has, th 3 to 4 leaves. We can only spread manure here till December 15th. And by that time, in most situations, the rye would be dormant as well. So I would say ideally if people put manure on, they want to do it before planting, but it's not always ideal.
So I don't want to lose Marilyn's question here in the chat, so I'm going to go to that next. What is your recommended resource for studying or deciding on what cover crop to choose, digital or hardcover? And no, Marilyn is not a plant of ours.
Yeah, well, so the Northeast Cover Crop Council has a cover crop selection tool that is a online tool. It's great. You can put, forage as a priority. You can put in different priorities and benefits that you're looking for. Maybe Victoria can put that in the chat so people have access to it. But there's also a lot of great book resources to cover crops for profitability. Um, so, I think there's a lot of places to look, and then asking around too and seeing what local farmers and other people in your area are having success with can always be a
Thank
great
you.
source of information.
So I just threw in the link to the page where we collate our tools because we have a lovely suite of tools put together. And then getting back to questions in the last few minutes here. How much land preparation is required to be done prior to cover cropping to obtain an excellent cover crop? Full plowing, harrowing, etc. prior to planting.
Boy, I hate, this is why I love being an extension specialist. It depends, right? If you if you have a no-till system, then no-tilling that cover crop into the field is, generally going to work just fine. If you're in a tillage system, you may have to till the ground so that it is friable enough, and an appropriate enough seed bed to plant the crop. It's a crop, and you have to think about what that crop needs to grow best given the situation. And so if your ground is used of tillage and you go out there and it is the ground's hard and it looks compacted, um, then you may need to till before you plant. But generally, I don't see people using full on tillage, right? Where they're moldboard plowing, disking, harrowing, field finishing. I will say that if you're going to harvest for forage and you're bringing a mower out there, then you want to pay special attention to how that field is prepped when you plant, because you can run into a lot of issues with your mower. So you may need to do a little more work. You may need to use a cultipacker to smooth the field a bit once you plant.
And I think that last point may be why David followed up with they were referring to corn cropping. I know you can get big chunks of biomass left over with the corn stubble. Does corn cropping affect how much you might have to beat up the soil?
Again, it really depends on the management of the farm and the field. Again, if you're in a plow till setting, where the field needs, sort of addicted to tillage, you may need to go out there and loosen the soil to plant the cover crop. Rye is pretty forgiving, so generally,
Mm.
relatively shallow, low disturbance tillage should be fine.
Awesome, thank you. Um, we're getting thanks in the chat, and I have put in a reminder that if you need the CCA CEU credit for this session, you need to either really quickly hit send on that message that you've typed up to Susan Brulette in the chat with your full name and CCA number, or you need to be prepared to email Susan our QR code for this session. We're gonna fix it, but anyway. So Heather, with that, thank you so much for speaking today, and thank you everybody else for attending. It's been a great session. I'm really hoping that we'll get to see you guys next week for the session presented by Etienne Sutton about cover crop variety trial results.
Ooh, yes.
Heather was talking a lot about the importance of cultivars, and that talk might be useful to y'all. So thank you guys so much, and I hope you guys have a great week.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Always happy to answer more questions. Shoot me an email or give me a call.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I think with that, we can stop recording and we can